So we're on Daf Ayin Daled Amud Beis, and we began the sugya of Esther b'far Hesi. We didn't finish it, so let's just go over that part of the sugya, and then we'll move on. Be'ez Hashem. The Gemara says the following: that b'shas hashmad, and this is on the top of Ayin Daled Amud Beis, one is obligated to give up his life for any gzera. In other words, even if you take a look at the top line, lishnuye arkasa de mesana, they force you to change the color of your shoe lace. With regard to other averos, then we have halacha farhesia. And what does that mean? That means even for any mitzvah of the Torah, and they force you at gunpoint, and it's in front of 10 Jews. So we're not talking about Arkas of the Masani, because that's not a mitzvah in the Torah. So that's unique to Shas Hashmad, but we're talking about a mitzvah like tzitzis, tefillin, whatever mitzvah it might be. The Gemara asks, "V'kava farhesi, Omer Rav Yaakov, Omer Rav Yochanan, ein farhesi pchusa me'asora, and pshiti Yisraelim be'inon, tichsiv v'nekdashti b'tov b'nei Yisrael." So we need the presence of 10 Jews, and then you have to give up your life for any mitzvah. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tisha Yisrael v'nochri echad ma'u. What happens if there are 9 Jews and the guy himself who's trying to force you to violate the Torah, can that be considered farhesia? And Toshma, the Gemara says, the Tani Rav Yana Yachua de Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Asya toch toch. We have Gzeir Shav of toch toch. Siv hacha. In the parsha of Kiddush Hashem b'farhesi, it says, "Mikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael." Uksiv hasam, in the parsha of Korach, it says, "Ibadlu mitocha eda azos." And in the parsha of Korach, when it says that you should separate yourself and distance yourself from the Eda, the word Eda is interpreted as 10 Jews. Malahalon, in Parshas Korach, in the case of Eda, it's Asora. Why? Because Asora is the minimum number you need to constitute an Eda. Eda means a community. V'kul Yisrael. And in that case, the Eda of Korach was made up only of Jewish people. Afkan, Asora, v'kul Yisrael. So too for Farhesia, you need Asora. In fact, the Gemara of Esther, when she went to marry and have a relationship with Achashverosh Farhesiavi, everybody knew about it. And she didn't give up her life to avoid having this relationship with Achashverosh. And the Gemara gives 2 answers. Omar Abaye Esther Kaka Olam Oisa Rav Omar Hanos Atzman Shiny. The Ilo Tema Hachi. If we're not going to agree that Hanos Atzman is a mitigating factor, so that even if the guy forces you to violate one of the mitzvahs HaTorah publicly in front of Asar Yisrael, we're going to always ask the question, and we're going to advance the contingency that his intention is to have you violate your Torah. But if his intention, his motivation is simply for the sake of his own benefits, like, for example, in the case of Achashverosh, his own pleasure, he didn't know that she was Jewish, so it's not Lavuri al Das, but rather it's Lanos Atzman. If you don't accept that contingency, that the Machayev of Farhesia for Yehard Val Yavar is contingent on the fact that the guy wants you to violate your Torah, then Hani Kvake V'Dimonki Hechi Avinalu. There were certain utensils that were sold in the market by Jews. They were the merchants, and those utensils were used for Avodah Zarah. The Goyim would purchase these kalim from the Jews. And those kalim were being used by the Goyim within their idolatrous service. And those are called kvake v'dimonke, which are translated as ki kibul. These are clay kibul, meaning they're receptacles. What do they put inside of it? It's like a little grill. You know when you buy these little movable grills and they put inside of it charcoal? You could buy them for like 50 shekel. I mean, the charcoal costs you more, but... So these were miyuadim lechamim. They were used on the holidays. You see, on the idolatrous holidays, they all packed into the temples. And in the temple, they needed heating units, to warm up the air. It was very cold. So they purchased from Jewish people these clay kibul in order to facilitate their celebration of the idolatrous holidays. Hechi avinale. How are we allowed to give them, sell them something which they will use to facilitate their idol worship? We are basically abetting in a crime. We are participating in their idolatry. And that's the concept called avizrayu d'avodah zarah. We're not worshiping Chas v'shalom, we're not participating in their celebration of idol worship, but we are helping them out. And if we're helping them out, that should come under the broader definition of avodah zarah, which is called avizrayu d'avodah zarah. And this is similar to what we discussed in terms of the Baal Hamor, who speaks about the case where this man wants to see a woman unclothed, and that was avizrayu de gili arayos. And avizrayu means like an appendix, so to speak, an extension, and we have an avizrayu d'avodah zarah. And if you take a look at the commentary here, he says that some Rishonim hold that this is an Isur of avizrayu d'avodah zarah, and others say it's lifnei iver. Now this is fascinating. We know that lifnei iver has two interpretations. One is Torah B'chsav, which is called Ein Mikra Yotzim Midei Pshuto, and then there's Torah B'al Peh. So in Torah B'chsav, you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. I don't know how anyone would be cruel enough to think that he wants to do such a thing. Maybe because he holds that a blind person is potter from Haggadah. I don't know. I'm just joking. Anyway, in the case of Torah B'al Peh sees this pasuk in a whole different light. And that is that you shouldn't give a person bad advice that would lead him to violate the Torah, or you can't help him in any way violate the Torah. Like, for example, if a Nazir wants to drink wine, heaven forbid, and you give him the wine to drink, you violate lifnei iver. That's based on Torah B'al Peh. That's not the simple, straightforward shot in the pasuk. Now, the Goyim are enjoined from the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, one of which is avodah zarah. And by your giving them the tools that they need to facilitate their service, you'd be violating lifnei iver. But what's fascinating about this is that lifnei iver, according to those Rishonim, encompasses not just to cause a Jew to violate the Torah or help him violate the Torah, but even to a guy violating his Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. So again, we have two interpretations of what would be the prohibition of selling these kvaki udamanki to the idol worshippers? Is it because we are violating avizrayu d'avodah zarah, which means any sort of actions that lead to avodah zarah or are part of the service of avodah zarah? That's all included under avizrayu d'avodah zarah. Or no, it's lifnei iver. But whatever it is, for our purposes, the bottom line is that it's prohibited. We can't play games with the goyim. If we start refusing to sell them these little heating units that we produce, who knows what the repercussions might be? Maybe they'll threaten to kill us. So what about Yeharg Val Yav? So you'll tell me, well, it's not a violation of the Gimel Averos Chamuros. It may come under an extended, a broader definition of Avodah Zarah called Avizrayu or on the Lifnei Iver, but we're not talking about the Gimel Averos Chamuros. The Jews are not worshiping the idols, Chas v'shalom. They're selling these heating units to the goyim, to the idol worship. But nevertheless, there's halacha of farhesia. It's public knowledge that we're there, we're the suppliers for these kvaki and demanki. If it's public knowledge, then the law is you have to give up your life rather than violate any part of the Torah, no matter whether it's Gimel Averos Chamuros or not. Yeharg Val Yavar, because it's for Hahesia. And this is a classic case of Farhesia. The answer is that they weren't buying from the Goyim. Buying from the Jews and forcing the Jews to sell these kalim, because otherwise the Jew, for the goal, let's call it the agenda of having the Jew violate his Torah. They don't know about Lifnei Iver. They don't know about Avizrayu d'avodah zarah. They are interested in their own benefit. They want to benefit from these kalim. They're not trying to challenge and undermine the Jewish religion. And therefore, the entire leniency permitting us to sell these kalim is predicated on Rava's contingency. And Rava says that Yeharg Al Yav Farhesi is contingent on Lavuri El Das. But if it's lanos atzmo kamachavin, they're only interested in their own benefit, then there's no Yeharg Val Yav. So imagine a situation where the Goyim, in order to benefit themselves, they're demanding the Jews violate the Torah. Like, for example, Shabbos. Shabbos is not one of the Gimel Averos Chamuros. But if it was a public desecration of the Shabbos, that would require Yeharg Val Yav, because that's called Shar Averos B'Farhesia. But the question is, why are the Goyim forcing the Jews to violate the Shabbos? So, for example, you remember that famous, terrible sentence that goes back many, many years before we were born, maybe, but we remember it. If you don't come in Saturday, don't come in Sunday. So the issue is, am I allowed to work on Shabbos because otherwise my family's going to starve to death? And maybe it's not a matter of starving to death, but it's a family that came to America and they're immigrants from Europe, from wherever, and they can't afford anything if they don't get this job. And the job says you have to come in Saturday. So many Jews would come in Saturday. They would try to minimize the full Shabbos, whatever. But they couldn't withstand the temptation. It was too difficult of a challenge. So you might ask, well, would they be obligated even to starve to death rather than violate the Shabbos? And the answer you would give is Farhesia. Everybody knows about it. They're going on the trains, from Brooklyn to New York, wherever they're going, and everybody knows they're violating the Shabbos. That's Farhesia, Yeharg Val Yav. But now the Gemara is saying, well, it all depends. Are the goyim telling you to work on Saturday because they want to be oker sadas, they want to undermine the religion, and they want to just obliterate Judaism? Or are they doing it because they need workers to come in on Saturday? Why should I hire a Jew boy who won't come in on Saturday when I can hire an Italian and he'll come in on Saturday? He has no problem working on Saturday. Ella says the Gemara La Nos Atzman Shaini, the only heter here that suspends the principle of Yeharg Val Yavor is that the guy is in this case Hanos Atzman. He's not Miskamin Lavir and Aldas. Therefore, you don't give up your life for that. It's Hachanami. Now we go back to Esther and we explain Esther's action based on Rava, that since Achashverosh was not motivated to get Esther to violate her Judaism, he didn't even know she was Jewish, therefore she's allowed to submit herself. And then Rabosa, we had this long tosus here, Veha, about why the Gemara doesn't even raise the issue of Gilead rights. The Asda Rava L'Tameh. So Rava's insistence on this contingency that Yeharg Val Yavor B'Farhesia only applies Lavuri Al Das but not Lanos Atzman is very consistent with another statement of Rav. The Omar Rava Akum di Omale Lahai Yisrael Aspasta B'Shabsa Ushdi L'Chiyuse. The guy forces the Jew to violate the Shabbos. Like we said before, if you don't come in Saturday. And what did the guy demand? He demanded something called shachas. Shachas is what we call animal fodder, animal food. And it's cut down in a very premature state. So if you leave the grains to grow to full maturity, that's called kol tzarkan. That's not for animals. We're not going to waste that on animals. We're going to use it to make bread and bake and cook, and all sorts of good, mizonos. But if, on the other hand, you cut down the wheat in a premature stage, after it reaches only 1/3 of its growth, that's animal fodder. Cannot be used to feed human beings. It's not edible. So the guy says to the Jew, I want you to cut down this shachas. Ushtilechi yisoy. And after you cut down this, I'm going to call it alfalfa. I don't mean that literally. Then I want you to feed it to the animals on Shabbos. Velo. And if you refuse to work for me like a slave, then I will kill you. So what were we paskin here? If it's public in nature and it's a violation of the Shabbos, then b'farhesia v'shar mitzvahs Yeharg Val Yavor. No, says Rava. Go ahead and violate the Shabbos. Liktil, cut down the shachas, v'lo lekatle, and don't let him cut you down. Save yourself, save your life. There's no Yeharg Val Yavor. And why is that? Because the guy's kavan is only lanos atzma. He is not trying to get the Jew to undermine and desecrate his whole das, his whole religion. That wasn't the motivation here. We're not talking about the Crusades or anything like that. So Rava is being very consistent that in cases of hanas atzman, we don't apply the principle of Yeharg Val Yavor. Whether that would apply to the Gimel Averis Chamuris or not, that's the issue of the Balamon. Now we have another case. Says Rava, if the guy says Shdila Nara, I want you to cut down this growing grain and throw it into the river. What is he indicating when he says throw it into the river? He's not getting any benefit from it. He's not feeding it to the animals. It's going down the drain, literally. Is then likatle v'lo likto. Let him kill you and don't violate the Shabbos. My taima, lavure milsa kaboy. The fact that he tells you to cut down the wheat on Shabbos and throw it overboard into the river, it means his motivation is to get you to violate your Shabbos. And that becomes Shar Mitzvahs B'far Hesya. Therefore, it's Yehoreg V'El. Now he has a question here from the Shut Tuv Tam Vidas Reb Shlomo Klug. This is number Tesayin. Mitchilas divrei Rava mashma sheyavo rak shepirei shel itzorach behemto ose. We have two possibilities with a middle of the road, so to speak. That's nishtaher and nishtahid. One possibility is that he tells him to cut down the shachas in order to violate the Torah. The other possibility is where he says, cut down the shachas, and he says nothing. And the third possibility is when he says, cut down the shachas and feed it to my animal. So in the two extreme cases, either where he says, cut down this shachas because I want you to violate your Torah, or, and that's clearly Yehar Galyam, or in the opposite polar extreme, where he says to him, cut down the shachas to feed my animal. There for sure it's lanos atzmo kovachavin and yavor ve'al Yehar. What about the middle category? He simply says, cut down the shachas. He doesn't say cut down the shachas because you're a no good Jew. He doesn't say cut down the shachas in order to feed my animal. He simply says to him, cut down my shachas. That's called stam. And Reb Shlomo Kluger says, if you read the Gemara carefully, you'll figure out what the law is in stam. Why? Because Rava's case was when the guy added two words. After he said, cut down the shachas, he said, Ushdilach, you saw it. Feed my animal. Clearly indicating lanos atzmo komachab. The implication is that dafka because he added the shtila behemti, which indicates that it's lanos atzmo. That's why we don't apply the principle of the Yereg V'El. But if it would have been a case of stam, had he dropped the words and omitted the words of shtila chayuso, and just said, k'tol aspasta b'shabsa, then Yereg V'El will. But misof dvarav, now we fast forward to the end of Rava, when Rava says that if he adds the word shti linara, throw it into the river, then you have to give him your life, because then you know for sure that it's lavuri al das komis kavin. He wants to get you to violate your Torah. Yehareg V'El Yavor. Why did Rava have to go that far to give a case of shti linara? Forget about shti linara. Why not a case where he said, Tol as pasta b'shabsa? He didn't tell him to feed his animals. He didn't tell him to throw it in the river. He just said, stop, cut down the spasta. So you get the impression that in that case, he would not be chayav in Yereg V'El. So we have what's called diyukim sosrim. We have two diyukim, and they contradict each other. From the beginning of Rava's words, we get the impression that if it was a case of stam, it would be Yereg V'El. And from the end of Rava, we get the impression that if it was a case of stam, it would be Yavor V'Al Yehoreg. Says Reb Shlomo Kluger, Shatam shesosam dvarav, Mishum shalagabi ktsiras shachas yesh mikre bestam sha'olav limsor nafshe. The yesh mikre bestam sheyavor v'al yehu. What's going on over here? Rav Shlomo Kluger says that there's no absolute rule with regard to stam. When the guy says to you, cut down the aspasta on Shabbos, he does not say for the purpose of feeding his animals. He does not say throw it in the river. He just says nothing. All he tells you is, buddy, if you don't cut down this aspasta, I'm going to cut you down. Your life is in danger, is at stake. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, it all depends on circumstances. And in certain circumstances, it's Yavar Ve'al Yehare. You will violate the Shabbat. In other circumstances, it's Yehar Ve'al Yavar, and you have to give up your life. What does that mean? What circumstances could make any bit of a difference here? You know, you're talking about cutting down aspasta on Shabbos, and he didn't tell you why. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, she'im sham gam goy v'tziva v'dafka es Yisrael likta. There were two people in front of him. So you've got let's call him Christopher, right? And in front of Christopher, there are two men. One is Paul, and the other is Yankel. So he's got a guy and he's got a Jew. To whom does he turn and say, cut down the shachas? He turns to Yankel. That's here Harig Val Yafa. Why? He says, Kevan sheyesh gam shom guy. V'tziva dafka es ha-Yisrael likta. Why didn't he ask this big burly guy named Krista, named Paul? And instead he wants this little Yidela to cut down the aspasta. V'lo pirishu litzarach behemto. And he didn't even bother saying to him, well, I'm going to feed, or you feed my animals. Then we assume that lavuri al das komiskam. Avalim ein shoy goy acher. There's no one else around. There's no Paul. It's just Christopher and Yankala. That's all that there is. Then ein litlo sheritzon lavur al das. We're not going to assume that he wanted the Jew to violate and desecrate the Torah. And therefore the halach would be Yavar Ve'al Yehari. Because there's no Lavuri al Das Komiskam. And even though he didn't add the words Lebehemto, feed my animal, we assume, until we know otherwise, that he just wants to feed the animal. Obviously, this doesn't apply to Shas Hashma. But in effect, the Reish of Rava, according to Rav Shlomo Kluger, is talking about circumstances in which there was another guy, there was another possible worker who could have accomplished the same goal of cutting down the aspasta. So therefore, we would assume, if it would have been Stam, that the intention of the guy was Lavuri al Das. Why? Because there's another guy there. So if, says Rava, the guy commands you to violate the Shabbos and there's a presence of a guy there in addition to the Jew, then we would normally assume Yehar Val Yavor because he's Lavuri al Das. But if he adds the two words, Ushdi Lechayusa, then he indicates that his Hana is his primary motivation. In the Sefer, maybe there's no guy around. So we should assume Bistama that he's going to feed the animals. He had no other option. There was no other worker who would do it, so he turned to the Jew. But now he adds the words ushdi linara, indicating clearly that he has no benefit and no anos atzma by cutting down the shachas. Wow. Very creative. His name was Kluger. Kluger means in English the smart one. Apparently he's very bright. Boy, mi name of Ami ben Noach mitzuval kedushas Hashem or eno mitzuval kedushas Hashem. This Gemara is a pella. We don't know what's going on here. The Torah says v'nikdashti b'soch b'nei Yisrael. What's the havamina that a guy should be mitzuva al kiddush Hashem? I mean, again, you could have another problem here because there are only 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Okay, the Gemara is going to raise that problem. But forget about that problem. I'll add Kiddush Hashem, throw it into the pot. Okay, it's not 7, it's 8. Fine. I'll survive that. But how can you tell me that a guy is mitzvah al Kiddush Hashem, state in Pasuk, v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael? So imagine a guy forces another guy to worship an idol. So Avodah Zarah is one of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Is there a Kiddush Hashem now that directs the guy to become a victim and be killed rather than worship an idol? And then the word v'nikdashti, the mitzvah of v'nikdashti, applies even to a guy. But I think the answer is Poshet. Kiddushas Hashem, Mesiras Nefesh of Yehareg V'Yava for a guy is in the presence of 10 Jews. So B'toch B'nei Yisrael means that there are 10 Jews there. If there are only Goyim there, then there's no Havamina that the guy would have to give up his life for Kiddush Hashem. Because the Pasuk says, V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. But let's say the guy is being forced to worship Avodah Zarah in the presence of 10 Jews. And it's hard to imagine such a case. Amar Abai Toshma Sheva Mitzvahs Tavu B'nei Noach Isa Tamyan Havi. Meaning, you're jacking up the number from 7 to 8. We have a Kabbalah that a Ben Noach has 7 mitzvahs. And in each one of those 7 mitzvahs, we have a separate drasha and a yalfusa to derive from the pasuk. Almost all the psukim are there at the time of Adam Rishon and Noach. And we derive that they're obligated in 7 mitzvahs. But the Kabbalah was 7 and not 8. Amalei Rava says, I'm not impressed. Inu v'chol Avizrayu. Now here's where we have the word Avizrayu. And we said that Avizrayu is like a secondary, auxiliary expansion of the Avodah Zarah. What are we saying? That somehow within the Isur of Avodah Zarah, built into it, there's Kiddush Hashem, there's Yehareg V'Yav. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at Yud Tes and Chaf. First of all, Chaf is an easy one. He says Havazraya means kitavlin and nilvil lemachal, something that's secondary to the ingredients. You throw in certain condiments, certain spices, but that's just to round it all off. But it's not really the critical mass. He says the following. The Yad Ramah, one of the Sephardic Rishonim, says the Iboya Isaac Shekavu Lavar Achas Misheva Mitzvahs. So we gave an example that's based on Rashi here called Avodah Zarah, but there are 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. So, for example, if the guy forces another guy to eat Avram and Achai, which is one of the 7 mitzvahs, the Gemara is vacillating now whether the guy has to give up his life. Abai would say no, because then you're adding another mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. And Rava says, forget about Kiddush Hashem. He's not allowed to eat the Avram and Achai because he's not allowed to eat the Avram and Achai, period. I don't need the pasuk with Ikdashti B'toch B'nei Yisrael to obligate the guy to give up his life. The halacha is that Avram and Achai is one of the 7 mitzvahs B'nei Noach. So how can he violate that? It's just simply because somebody is forcing it. We have a principle called V'chai B'hem. V'chai B'hem applies to a Jew. That pasuk was addressed to the Jewish people, but it doesn't say V'chai B'hem by a guy. So a guy can't violate his 7 mitzvahs B'nei Noach in any circumstance whatsoever. It's an absolute rule. And therefore, Kshikafu Lavar al Achas Misheva Mitzvahs, Yeharg Val Yavar, according to Rava. Kosova Aruch Laner, Shasiba Shlo Pirish Rashi Asiboyes Kedas Harama. Why didn't Rashi just simply mention all Sheva Mitzvahs? Why does he focus our attention exclusively on Avodah Zarah? Mishum Shaya Poshut Vienov, She'ein Tzad Lomar, Shemitzvahs Kiddush Hashem, She'nemra B'Yisrael Noheges Gam B'Goyim. Says the Aruch Laner, Rashi was bothered by our question. The Torah says, V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. What's the havamina that a guy would be obligated in Kiddush Hashem? V'rak l'gabe Isra Avodah Zarah. Bezuder aloch and Avodah Zarah. It's a separate aloch and Avodah Zarah. Here's where there was a havamina that a guy is mitzvah al Kiddush Hashem. Shekol atzmo noad lefarsem shem Hashem ba'olam. Man was created to acknowledge the existence of God, and he wants to worship an idol. Is possessed tapku b'nei yeshiva shema mitzvah zu kolelas simsaris nefesh es hanefesh l'kadosh Hashem. So let's just point out here that there's a gigantic premise here in Rashi. And when I say gigantic, I mean it's very revolutionary. We understand, before Rashi at least, that all Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach are shava b'shava. They're all on the same equal level. All the dinim apply equally to all 7. For example, a guy could be put to death for the violation of any of the 7 mitzvahs. Any of them. Number 2, a guy could be put to death even if he didn't get asra, there was no warning. And Chazal say, Azarasim zui misasa. Once the guy was enjoined from the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, then that's a built-in asra. We don't need a separate asra. That applies to all 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. How many judges do we need to judge a guy? as we discussed in the past, one judge. How many Eidim do we need? One witness. When do we put him to death? With Asra, without Asra? Without Asra. In front of what? Beis Din? In front of one Chacham. And these laws apply straight across the board to all Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, including Avram and Achad. That's how we understood it before Rashi. Rashi says something different. It's not all one mikshachas, one body of 7 equal laws. Avodah Zarah should be taken out of the bunch and put in a separate category. And then Afkamida is going to be Yeharg Val Yavam. The guy, in the case of Avodah Zarah, where they're forcing him to worship an idol and they'll kill him, he has to be willing to be killed. And Rashi learns that that's a unique halacha in Avodah Zarah, because that's the essence of man. Man was created for the purpose of recognizing the Almighty. And if now he is going to do Avodah Zarah, he's going to worship an idol, then his whole purpose of existence was undermined. And therefore he might as well die. So death, in this case, is a better option than life and worshiping Avodah Zarah. Because life and worshiping the Avodah Zarah is antithetical. Life becomes meaningless if there's Avodah Zarah, because the whole meaning of life is to recognize the Almighty as the single creator. But the other Rishonim, the Yad Ramah, in their mind, all 7 mitzvahs are one entity, are mikshachas. And we cannot differentiate between one and the other. And therefore, if there's a Havamin in the Gemara that a Ben Noach has to give up his life al Kiddush Hashem, it applies equally to all 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach. So if you take a look at Tosfos, Dibra Maskil Ben Noach Mitzuva al Kiddush Hashem, V'im Tomar, the last 2 lines on the page, V'hava Chai B'hem B'Yisrael Ksiv. How could you even entertain the possibility that a Ben Noach, in order to save his life, will violate one of the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach? Even in Yisrael, we wouldn't allow a Jew to violate the Torah for the sake of saving lives, except for the pasuk v'chai b'hem, and that pasuk v'chai b'hem gives a special matir for the sake of pikuach nefesh to violate the law of the Torah. So we have a unique license that's inherent in the v'chai b'hem, but a guy doesn't have a chai b'hem. V'chai b'hem was addressed to Bnei Yisrael, and Memela, of course he has to give up his life. There's no matir, there's no heter here of a chaybaim to allow the guy to violate any of his mitzvahs. So do you see what's going on over here? There's like from one extreme to the other. We didn't even understand the Hava, meaning that a guy could be Mitzuva al Kiddush Hashem because it says V'nikdashti v'toch b'nei Yisrael. Tosfos doesn't understand how could there be a Hava meaning of Yavar ve'al Yehoreg in the case of Ben Noach when he has no v'chai b'hem. There's no matir. The Yeshlomar did Dilma lo itzduch v'chai b'hem elahechet lo nelif mishar mitzvahs mirotzeach v'nar mirosa dafilu b'tzina Yehareg val yaver l'kuliyam. The Torah had to introduce v'chai bohem because we would have said, if not for v'chai bohem, that even in Shar Mitzvahs, he has to give up his life, even B'tzina. Why? Because we're going to derive it from Nara Murasa and Rotzeah. So we need v'chai bohem to sort of plug up the dam, to not allow the water to overflow and flood. But therefore puts a stopper and says that a Jew does not have to give up his life, even if it means violating the Torah, because the Torah says v'chai bohem. So l'maskanas hatosvis, in pure svara, if we were only operating within the world of logic, we don't need v'chai bohem. The distance between Tosin and Havamin and Tosin and Maskana is like worlds apart. In the Havamin, Tosin says you cannot allow violating any law of the Torah, even for the sake of human life, if not for the pasuk v'chai bohem. So in the case of a guy, he doesn't have a v'chai bohem, he's going to have to give up his life for any of the 7 mitzvahs. In the Maskanas HaTosfos, on the contrary, I don't need v'chai bohem. It's absolutely logical to assume Yavar Val Yehari to save my life. And then Afkamina is going to be good, Ben Noah. According to Tosas Havamina, that we need a matir of a chayim, because otherwise we would say Yari Val Yavar. Well, a guy doesn't have the matir of a chayim, and then we don't understand our Gemara that vacillates. But according to Maskonas HaTosfos, even in the absence of a chayim, the assumption, the logical, intuitive conclusion we would have derived is that you have to violate the Torah. You have to live, even without a chayim. So what do I need v'chai? Because of technicalities. What's the technicality here? The mechanics? Well, the Torah said to the Jew, then in the case of Rotzeach and Aramarasa, you have to give it your life. Maybe that should be a binyan, and from that we should derive that in general for the mitzvahs you have to give up your life. So for that I need v'chai as the plug, as we said before. In the case of Ben Noach, it's a simple svara that v'chai b'hem v'lo yishim even without the posuk and yavar ve'al yehar. So what is the Gemara's suffix now? Tosas' conclusion is that v'chai b'hem could apply even without v'chai b'hem, meaning in the case of Ben Noach, we don't need v'chai b'hem, and he would still be under the rubric of Yavar Ve'al Yehar. So what's the maskana?
Are we worried now if he does it before Hesia or not?
You see, as far as a Ben Noach is concerned, this, what we're saying is, just let me think about your question one more minute. So I think, Steve, your question is addressed by footnote number Yud Ches, but it's not explicit. It's implicit, I think. He quotes a Gemara later on Daf Ayin Hey that the status of a guy is called Shara Veros. And therefore, if there's a Havamina that a guy would have to give up his life al Kiddush Hashem, it could not apply B'tzina, because Shara Veros, even for Yisrael, doesn't generate Kiddush Hashem unless it's b'far Hesya. And if we say that, as far as the guy is concerned, it's like Shara Veros Eitzel Yisrael, then as he points out here on the second line, B'tzina, Vadai Eino Tzarech Limsoras HaNefesh. And therefore, the whole entire suffix of the Gemara is only b'far Hesya. But honestly, I don't know how to reconcile that with this Tosfos that we just learned, because Tosfos is saying that the Havamina was that there's no v'chaybayim by a guy, and therefore there's no matir. So what difference does it make whether it's far Hesya or B'tzina? I don't know how to reconcile this footnote with what we just learned in Tosfos. So maybe we'll leave that for another time. That requires a lot more study. Okay, then. So let's just figure out what we have tomorrow. Correct?